afternoon. I'm Cassandra Borchers from Thompson, Hine, and we are doing the second in a three-part series about board obligations with respect to continuity planning and attracting new board members when the time is right. Today, we have Dina, Carolyn, and Jeannie joining us. Like I mentioned, this is a second and three-part series. The last one will be in October of this year. And at that last one, we will be talking about onboarding new board directors. I have the privilege of being joined by these three exceptional and experienced panelists. Dina Tantra, many of you know, is an independent board director and chair for the Heartland Funds. She's chair of nominating and governance committee for Boston Trust Walden Funds and Thornburg Income Builder Opportunities Fund, and is also director for Mutual Fund Directors Forum. Carolyn McPhillips is the president of Mutual Fund Directors Forum, and Jeannie Lewis is board chair for CEF Accelerator Platform US Bank. Ladies, welcome, and thank you again for joining me today.
Thank you. Looking forward to it. I think we've got a good session ahead of us.
Yes, absolutely. So we are hoping today's discussion will be interactive. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat boxes, which is probably in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and we will try to be monitoring those throughout the presentation. With that, let's go ahead and get started. And we're going to start with Carolyn. Some of you may have seen the Mutual Fund Directors Forum report on fund director recruitment practices from March. So why don't you, if you don't mind, Carolyn, take us through this and call out any salient points you think we should be focusing on.
That's great. Thank you, Cassandra. And I look forward to having a chat today with Dina and Jeannie as well. So thanks for having me here today. So this conversation is very timely. We just issued a report on fund board recruiting practices earlier this year. As Cassandra mentioned, I encourage you to go to our website and take a look at that report if you want something more in depth. But in the interim, I'm going to give you just a couple of highlights from the report. So the report reflects data from 79 separate fund boards on questions regarding the board's most recent director search, as well as their plans for their next search for their next director. The boards included a range of assets under management from under $2 billion to over $275 billion. So it really does cover the gamut of fund complexes in the industry. The distribution across the size of the complexes was balanced. So that means we're not overrepresenting small fund board approaches or large fund board approaches. So I think what it will show is sort of a nice slice of director recruiting across all fund board types. And in addition to size, it's also type. So we have open-end funds, closed-end funds, ETFs, and series trust boards are also represented in this data. So I think no matter what kind of board you're sitting on, I think you can use this data as sort of a bellwether to measure your recruiting practices against.
And so Carolyn, I would just jump in. We have a mix of people on the call. A lot of them are sitting board members, and I think this survey, these results will be informative as they are trying to set up their own searches. They can see what other boards are doing, lessons learned. And I think for those who are candidates listening in, I think it will also be insightful because they'll understand how a board is approaching the recruiting process. So I think going through this, the different participants are going to have some interesting takeaways.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100% because I think the boards, especially for those boards who haven't necessarily recruited in a while or weren't necessarily happy with how the process went, I think they can learn a lot. I think the board candidates, can be helpful for them as they sort of think about how they're going to go about trying to find a board position. So 75% of the respondents in our survey have recruited a new director in the last 5 years. And 58% of those hired one director, 33% hired two directors, and 8% hired three directors. So I think some of this can reflect kind of some boards hired during the pandemic, some boards waited until after the pandemic and maybe hired more directors at one time than they maybe would have otherwise. 85% of the respondents indicated that they plan to recruit a new director in the next 5 years. And 34% of those said they're going to do this search in the next 2 years. So that's sort of an indication of the number of boards who will probably be looking for a new director in the near future. 80% of boards use both virtual and in-person interviews as part of their process. We're going to talk more about sort of process issues later, but just giving you an overview of how this works. 75% include an interview with management. I think some boards have differing opinions on that, but we were interested to see the number of boards in our survey who include management in the interview process. 80% used a gap analysis and 64% used a skills matrix to identify those characteristics of the new directors that they were looking for in their search. And we also asked about search time. And so 65% took 7 to 18 months for the surveys or for the recruiting. So, I think for on the candidate side, that's a reminder to, be patient. The process takes a long time. And then on the fund board side, I think it's a good reminder to make sure you're planning ahead far enough to give yourself enough time to get through all the steps in the process that you're going to need to make a good decision at the end of the day. The vast majority of boards still use personal and professional networks of existing board and trusted advisors. So fund counsel, audit firms, management, and other trusted service providers to the board. 58% of boards reported hiring a candidate who was known to at least one member of the board. So, I mentioned earlier the gap analysis and skills matrix. Boards are very deliberate in their process, but this is still very much a people business. And they very much want to know the candidates that they're considering for their boards. 34% reported using the MFDF's candidate database during their board searches, and 18% reported using a search firm. I just want to make a point about search firms in this area. Some boards have been enormously successful, but the search firms are not incredibly active in the fund board recruiting side because there's just not that many board positions available. So it's not a lucrative part of their business. So they do it. And some of them don't, but some of the larger firms do fund board recruiting, but it's not sort of a key part of their business like CEO recruiting. So just keep that in mind if you're considering using a search firm, to make sure you ask some very detailed questions about their experience doing a fund board search. We also asked about the number of candidates considered. So 56% of boards who hired one director reviewed 1 to 7 resumes. So, that's a lot of candidates for one position. So that's another thing to sort of keep in mind for both sides, actually. 38% who hired 2 directors reviewed 8 to 20 resumes. Most boards interviewed 1 to 9 candidates in their most recent search. So for the candidates out there, please don't get discouraged if you get interviewed and don't get a position, because there's a whole lot of reasons that might be the case. And they're interviewing a lot of individuals for potentially one director slot that's available. 24% of boards who hired 2 directors in their last recruiting interviewed 3 or fewer candidates. So, either they did a very good job of sort of narrowing down the candidates that they interviewed, or it was just, a perfect storm of, aligning the interviews that they set up with the candidates that they needed. And 45% of boards that hired 1 director interviewed 3 or fewer candidates. So, sometimes it's not a big numbers game, but just to understand that, if you get interviewed, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the position. And that can be for many reasons. We also asked boards if they were happy with their process and what they might want to change for their next recruiting. The vast majority of respondents said they were very happy with the outcome of their last recruitment process. 87% of boards were very satisfied with how the process went, which was a great sign. That means the boards were very deliberate in their process and they used something that helped them identify really highly qualified candidates. But despite that, 64% said they're going to anticipate, maybe even slightly changing their approach to their recruiting for the next time they're going out to look for a new candidate. And among those boards who are planning changes, the most cited reason was, they're just more aware of where they can go now when they're sourcing candidates, sort of how they should consider it, how they should interview. And we're going to talk about a lot of these issues a little bit later in the webinar. So it's always nice to see boards working for continuous improvement. And even though they were satisfied with the outcome, they know they can do better next time. So I think that's a great sign for the future of recruiting directors. So one question we get a lot is about qualifications of directors and what boards are searching for. So 45% are searching for generalists and 35% are searching for specialists. Now we define these in very specific ways with respect to the survey. So specialists are defined as experts in a specific functional area, strategy, fund type, or other. So that's a very, maybe somebody with deep distribution experience, for example. Whereas a generalist was defined as a professional with a variety of experience or high-level experience with oversight of multiple business line or functional areas. Now, a generalist does not necessarily mean someone from outside of the industry. That could be someone inside the industry, but just with more general experience. So, maybe a C-suite, a CFO or a CEO, something with just a broader oversight. So, and then here's something we also get asked a lot, mostly from the candidate side, is we asked whether there are certifications that are compelling when boards are doing board searches. And we were told by 89% of our survey respondents that the answer to that is no. That, they're really looking to your actual functional experience more so than, any kind of certification that you get. So that's an overview, but I do really encourage you to go take a look at the actual survey results, because, it goes into more in depth in all of these areas. But, a full summary of the report would take all of our time. And I think the discussion areas that we want to get to, I think will help solidify your process much more than just a recitation of survey results.
And Carolyn, I think you made a great point about boards being very strategic and intentional about recruiting. I think in my experience, I think that has evolved over time. We kind of all share anecdotes from the past about, well, if so-and-so was at my country club, or, I used to golf with them or whatever, I invited them to the board. I think, the fund director world has become more complex. And I think boards are being very intentional about finding people mostly from the industry, although there are some boards who are looking for people outside the industry. But I think they are looking for, some deep expertise. Some people are looking for people with board experience as well. And once you start seeing these board bios, people have impressive backgrounds. There are a lot of candidates out there, and it's about cutting through the clutter. It's showing that you're the best fit for the board. But it's great for the recruiting side. It's definitely difficult from the candidate side.
And I would just echo that. There's a wealth of really great candidates out there who would make really great board directors. So my advice to boards seeking candidates is don't settle for a candidate that you're not 100% confident in, because I promise that you can find the perfect person for your board. It just takes time and patience.
And I think that sets us up. Jeannie, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say, the strategic and intentional search for board members can begin really early on. So I'm on a startup board. We just formed. Our first meeting was back in October. There's 4 of us, but we're already thinking about, will we want to add another board member, in the next year or 2 as we grow? And what do we want that board person to bring to the table? And and what we think we want now, will that necessarily be what we want a year and a half from now when we start our search? So I think it's also not being wedded to what you think, but having this be evergreen and to keep asking yourselves, and maybe the annual assessment time is a good time to do that. If we were to bring somebody on, when do we think that would be? When do we want to start? Does our skills matrix cover what we're looking for? Has it changed? Did we identify something a few years ago that might not necessarily be what we need. And also the reason to think about this, even if you don't think you're going to bring somebody on for the next few years, it's still good to strategically think about it, because unfortunately things happen, and sometimes you need to fill a spot you didn't know you would need to fill. And instead of starting from scratch in a desperation mode, it's always good to have thought about that at a time.
That, Gina, you have an interesting point about what we kind of call the pipeline, right? You're not necessarily actively looking, but you're starting to build those relationships. And we had a pretty robust discussion about this around the board table. Do you have a pipeline? Is it, how do candidates feel about being in a pipeline, knowing that there isn't an active search? Do you feel like you're overcommitting? And to your point, you never know if something's going to happen, and you're going to need another board member. And so kind of establishing some relationships, but explaining to candidates, look, it's a pipeline. We don't have an active search, but we're interested in you. We want to know if you're interested in us, and let's continue the conversation. And then someday when we do have a search, we'd love to have further conversations.
I also think, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to echo that. I think being strategic and proactive are two important pieces of the puzzle. And as you mentioned, Jeannie, your wants and needs may evolve over time. So even if you have that pipeline, and even, the person who's in the pipeline right now, when the time comes, maybe they're still the right person, maybe they're not.
I also think, and we're going to talk about networking later on, and we'll probably spend a lot of time about networking, but I also think it's good for the directors on the call, as well as I know that there are some candidates on the call. It's always good to have a pipeline and to have a relationship with the directors, because even if a director, if you don't fit a need for a particular board at that particular time, that director also has friends who might come to them and say, hey, we're looking to fill a board seat in the next 8 months. This is a type of candidate we're looking for. Do you know of anybody? And even if that person doesn't fit what you need, that doesn't mean you wouldn't say, hey, I've had a couple of conversations with this great candidate. Maybe you should talk to them. So anyways, and we'll talk more about networking, but that just seemed to kind of jump into the pipeline conversation right now.
We're kind of jumping into that strategic approach to recruiting, and I'll share what we've done with one of our boards. Is the self-assessment process was kind of the starting point. And in the 40 Act space, there is a technical requirement for a self-assessment, and it's very limited. It says you must talk about kind of the number of funds in your complex, and you must talk about kind of the committee structure. Well, anything beyond that is gravy. But what we did is, instead of just building it into one meeting a year, which could often be, the last session before everyone's trying to get on a plane, we've actually embedded it into all 4 in-person board meetings that we have. And I've sort of built kind of a mini agenda. The first session we do is more about what each director is thinking about in terms of personal development, education, what they want to accomplish over the year. The second one is more about the business strategy. And I think that's going to be important as we start to talk about the skills matrix, because as the business evolves, your skill sets are going to evolve. And when you have a sitting director today with certain skills, if the strategy goes in a different direction, you're not necessarily wanting to fill that sitting director's seat. You may fill a potential seat with different skills. For example, if your advisor is talking about launching ETFs or interval funds or more complex products, you may be looking for a candidate who does not fit any of your current skill sets. So thinking about that strategically. Then the third part of our self-assessment, we focus on what could we be doing more effectively in terms of board meetings and discussions, and then the last one is, are we hitting what's regulatorily required? So we start with the the self-assessment, and then we also have a skills matrix. And I know there was some questions beforehand about our skills matrix. I think in our prep session, we've sort of honed in on there will not be a single skills matrix that every board will have the same line items. I think you're going to have some set of experiences. For example, you may have investment management experience, you may have legal compliance regulatory experience, you may have distribution experience, you may have operations experience. You'll likely have a set of skills that your board will agree upon. And I say agree upon because people have different definitions for a single skill. So you're going to want to have a conversation of, when I say I have investment management experience, what does that mean? And then there's also a part of this matrix that's a little softer. It's more on the EQ cultural fit side, which I think we'd all agree is difficult to capture in a matrix, but is a very real part of the recruiting and selection process. And then, Carolyn also talked about, are you going for generalist or specialist? And I think some of it may depend on your board size, right? If you have a larger board, you have the luxury of getting certain specialists. If you have a smaller board, you tend to have, like ours, more of the liberal arts approach of, everyone's kind of a generalist, and you may have some strengths.
Dina, I wanted to jump in there. One of the boards that I was being recruited for, and they were looking for, their one thing wasn't general. They didn't want specialists. Their one thing was the person had to know the industry. The industry is so highly regulated. It's getting more complex by the day. There is no longer did they feel that they could take somebody on the board who this is what a mutual fund is. This is how you redeem share, and none of that. They had to, but you didn't have to be legal regulatory compliance. You didn't need to be operations. You didn't need to be risk. They weren't looking for somebody deep in distribution, but table stakes had to be, you needed to know the industry, and you couldn't be a newbie in it because they just felt that it was, otherwise they didn't have the time and you'd be drinking from a fire hose. Mm-hmm. So, I think there's that too. So, not generalist, not specialist, but, and I think it goes to, what does that particular board want and what do they agree that they're looking for? And I think that's where you need to start.
Yeah. I think that's an incredibly important point to make, is I think sometimes boards run into issues with their searches because they haven't spent enough time on the front end deciding what it is that they actually want from the search. I think if you go in with sort of undefined search criteria, unless you really are just going to make a decision based on, sort of how the EQ part of it, I think you have to really spend a lot of time on the front end to decide what you and your board colleagues really need on the board to fill out the board, because I think otherwise you're going to be disappointed with the candidates that you're seeing because they're not going to be responsive to this thing that you didn't define. And so we see a lot of boards running into that issue. And there's a couple of other points I'd like to make too. And one of that, if you're going to seek out a specialist, just remember that specialist has to do all the other things on the board too. They are not responsible for overseeing distribution or cybersecurity or, portfolio management. They're on the board, so they have to be able to do everything. And so I think when you're looking, if you do decide you want a specialist, I think that's perfectly within the purview of the board, but just make sure that specialist can put out their lens a little bit farther to make sure they can do the rest of the board's responsibilities as well. And also that they're not going to try to run the management company and, sort of cross a line that's not appropriate for a board member. And so I think specialists in particular can, fall into that trap a little bit, and the rest of the board can too, by deferring to, sort of a quote unquote specialist. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And then to Jeannie's point about the industry experience, we're seeing more and more boards that will not consider people outside of the industry. That does not mean that every single board will not, because I do know boards that do, and they like that sort of additional kind of outside perspective to add diversity to the board in a different way. But that really does depend on the resources of the board to get this new director up to speed on, how does a mutual fund or ETF or closed-end fund, how do these products operate in the marketplace, in addition to, all of the other board responsibilities.
Carolyn, I want to say one more thing about specialists too. And this is not to say that people shouldn't look for specialists, but most boards, when you join a board, you are not doing your 9-to-5 job that made you the specialist that you're being hired for. And so depending on what that specialist skills are, 3 years or 2 years, when does those specialist skills really are they not helpful to the board in the same way that you thought that they were going to be when you brought that person on, which makes Carolyn's other point that you need to make sure that that board member can do the other parts of what's required of the board member, because the farther they're away from being a specialist, that kind of falls off.
Yeah.
Can fall off.
Jeannie, I think one of the examples on that is, AI, cybersecurity, right? Everyone around the board table, has this almost reaction of, oh, we don't know enough about cybersecurity. We don't know enough about AI. We feel like we're behind it. So why don't we recruit a specialist? But to your point, it's evolving so quickly, and especially if you're hiring somebody who is now retired from their daily job, how quickly are they going to be out of it? And is it more effective for the board or management to augment that expertise through consultants or education sessions? Kind of to that point, Carolyn, you talked about certifications. I've seen a ton of certifications out there, whether it's, an ESG certification or an AI certification. You can sign up and pay thousands of dollars for these certifications. As a NomGov chair, I tend to think about people who've done the job for 30 years as opposed to somebody who attended an online course for 8 weeks. So to me, I was in that camp where a certification doesn't move the needle for me, because if I'm truly looking for that type of expertise, I'm not looking for it from somebody who just sort of ordered it online. Not that they didn't do good work, but that's not necessarily the same quality of expertise I'm looking for when I think about my gap analysis.
And that goes back to your point, Dina, about what it means to have a particular skill. Did you have to work in it? Could you take a lot of classes on it? Do you need a certification in it? And I think that's something that's worth a robust board discussion to decide, because there are boards out there. Everybody doesn't automatically agree what it means to have fill in the blank experience. And so I think before you go out and do the search, the board needs to all be on the same page about what that means, and how you're going to fill those gaps if you don't have it, because maybe you can't find the perfect person that you're looking for. And to your point, Dina, about getting more education, whether it's from the management company, whether it's from third parties who provide education. I think there's a lot of avenues to fill in some gaps if you don't have the candidate that fills the gaps. And you can't have a new candidate every time something happens in the industry, right? As the industry evolves and gets more complicated, your boards would be 25 people if every time something happened, you added a new director. And so I think it's understanding what you really need to be represented by the background of the people around the table, and then how you can augment those backgrounds in a way to work effectively together.
I'd like to jump in because we have a question from somebody in attendance, which actually ties into one of the questions I was going to ask. So in terms of resources, I mean, both directions, in terms of sitting board members, how can they find board candidates? And then the flip side of that is, you know, we talked about this in our series last year. Are those the same places that candidates can go to upload their resume or find out if there's any openings? So,
Yeah, I think when we were talking about resources, I think they fall into some buckets, and we'll talk about each of them. But networking, I think is the biggest bucket that covers them all, and we'll talk about how what is effective networking, both from the board side as well as the candidate side. Then there's databases like the Mutual Fund Directors Forum database. People attend conferences, directors attend conferences, and they talk to other directors. It's kind of a form of networking, the conferences, but
right.
But that's, you know, another sub bucket. We mentioned recruiting firms, and some complexes still do use those recruiting firms. And then there are organized groups like Latin corporate directors, et cetera. And we could talk about all of those buckets, but I think we can start at the networking bucket. Everybody on this call, whether you're a director or a candidate or a service provider, you already have a network, and you've probably built those relationships over however many years you've been in this industry and a working adult. The thing about the board search that I found was from the candidate side is when I was fully working, you know, my regular, and I would say 9 to 5, but everybody here knows there's no such thing as a 9 to 5 job anymore. You just didn't have the time to dedicate to nurturing your network. So I always felt like if I got an incoming, I would from somebody, I would always take that, but you didn't have the time to reach out. And so I think if you're starting this search from either perspective, look at the network you already have and the relationships you already have. And if you're on the candidate side, tell people, I want to be on a board. I want to be on this type of board. This is why I want to be on this type of board. This is what I bring to the table. Here's my elevator speech. And also ask to be connected to that person's network. And then from the flip side, if you are a director and your complex is looking for candidates, and we don't mean this to be, and I know it's the old boys network, don't cancel me. We don't want this to be you only look within yourself and who you know, but you know a lot of people, and you know other people who know a lot of people. And I think you can approach it that way as well, which is, who do we know around the table that might be a good fit for this group? Who else do we know who might be, meeting other people who we could ask? And it's really keeping track of it too. So when I was a seeker, I had an Excel spreadsheet with hundreds of contacts, and it was work, but it was enjoyable work. Who have I called? Who have they said they were going to, what kind of conversation did I have? When was the last time I talked to them? Is there any reason why I should go back and talk to that person to update them on something that's interesting? Or did I listen to something that they said to me, and I know that they're interested in interval funds, and this law firm just put out a great piece on interval funds. Maybe I can send it to that person because I listened, and that was a relationship, and I don't want it to only be a one-way street. So I can reach out. And from the board perspective, who are candidates that might have reached out to me that were really impressive, and that I could open myself up, up the board to. So I think it's always networking. Networking is all relationships. Sitting around a board table, you're making decisions with people, not robots yet, not AI. So who do you want around the table with you that can bring good independent business judgment, who are curious, who are not afraid to share their point of view, what other people are around your table that don't take up all the room, don't take up all the air in the space.
Yeah.
Because if you have somebody who's too dominant on your board, while you know what their opinion is, they might stifle everybody's opinion around, and that's also not a particularly great thing to bring around the table. But how do you find that out? It's through your networking. So I'm going to pause on networking there.
Yeah, Jeannie, I'll jump in, because especially as sitting directors, I would challenge all of us to say, who do we not yet know?
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's easy to sort of cast the net and say, okay, these are people I know or met. I think it's more interesting to say, who have I not yet met? And how can I go find those people? And it talks about the types of people you want around the board table. And everyone says, oh, it's got to be a good cultural fit. But a cultural fit doesn't mean that everyone thinks the same. It doesn't mean that everybody agrees. But you've built a level of trust, a level of respect, so that you can have challenging conversations coming from different perspectives in a safe space where you're sort of pushing each other. And I know I've said this on another panel, but I quote somebody else. It's not my quote, but I don't want to be the smartest person in the room. I want to help make the room smarter. And you do that by bringing in different perspectives and people with different experiences and different backgrounds who think of things differently. One of the boards I'm on, when each of us asks a question, I'm like, wow, I never even thought of that question. And I think that's, when we start to talk about diverse perspectives, that's really interesting. And so to this question about resources and where do you find candidates, I challenge all the board members to think about who they don't yet know, and how do you then find those people?
Yeah.
Some boards spend more time on it than others. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Yeah, and I think it's important. I think you and Jeannie both made some important points that I'd like to underscore. And one of that is, the cultural fit is not about everybody agreeing. It's about understanding what your role on the board is and what the role of a director is to provide effective oversight. And I think it's very easy to conflate those two things, because you like people who think like you. I mean, you have a natural affinity for those people. And so you can confuse sort of building a board with a good culture with, building a board of people you want to go on vacation with or something. And those two things aren't necessarily the same thing. You need to work effectively together, and you need diverse viewpoints around the table to make sure that you're covering the gamut of questions that come up. And I think the point about networking that Jeannie made goes back to her point at the beginning about sort of continually understanding kind of what you need on your board, because this is not a process. If you are trying to expand your network to, as Dina points out, the people you don't know, you can't do that in a month. This is a long-term proposition. So, you almost need to, when you're on a board, to constantly be out there meeting people and thinking as you meet potential directors through this lens, even if, it turns out that your needs change by the time you're actually filling a position. I think the broader your network is, the more likely you're going to be able to make some connections that will fulfill what your board needs, down the line when you actually do have an open position. So I think it's just something, this is another example of, you need time, and most people don't make great decisions if you don't have time. And so making sure you're committing yourself, and your fellow board members are committing themselves to making this a priority, right? To get to know people who might be directors out there, I think is extraordinarily important.
And I wanted to add to that too, like in building on what Dina said, is how do you meet the people you don't know? And I think some of it is using the database, right? So there, what people come through when you query a database. I think we've mentioned the service providers. So the law firms, the audit firms, administrators, they know people that you might not necessarily know as well. And so making sure that you're meeting people along the way and open to meeting people along the way. And then what I would say is, I've made a personal pitch because myself, so many people who I'd never met people introduced me when I was a seeker to wonderful directors who didn't know me from Adam, who spent time talking to me and who connected me with their networks as well. And so I made a point to say, I will pay it forward. Even before I got on a board, I'm like, if somebody wants to know about the journey, even before I got on a board, I'll talk about my journey, what works, what doesn't work, the roller coaster of, getting to finals and not getting on the board, and how you how you celebrate that win, even though you didn't get on a board, but how great that you made it to those interviews. And now that I'm on a board, I even say even further that I will pay it forward. And I think most directors I have met in this space are already there and willing to talk to people. But if you're a director on this and you haven't decided that you want to open yourself up to others in the network, it's good for your fund complex. It's good for you, and it's good for the people you're talking to.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things about the director community is how open they are to helping others on their journeys as well. I'm always happy to see how helpful that fund boards are, because they're committed to making all boards effective. And so I think so many directors are willing to give a lot of time and energy to improving the fund director community overall. And I think that's really great.
Yeah.
I do want to just say a couple words about our database. It's come up a couple of times. So we do have a database. It has over 500 active profiles. So I always like to highlight that, because that shows that there's no shortage of really highly qualified individuals who want to serve on fund boards. And I think it's also a good message for the candidates, because there's a lot of people out there who want not a lot of jobs. There's, somewhere just over 2,000 fund director positions entirely in the entire industry. And so, just to keep that in mind as you're searching, because it is highly competitive. We did 15 searches for member boards. This is a member benefit, so our member boards can use our database. We did 15 of those searches in 2024. And just to contrast, most search firms do about 1 or 2 fund board searches a year. So, we get a lot more board search activity than even the professional sort of search firms. So that's something I like to highlight as well. And our databases, members don't come into our database, and search it themselves. It is a curated experience. They contact my colleague Leslie with the specs of the individuals that they're looking for on their board, and she gives them a set of resumes. Sometimes it takes a couple of iterations, because it's whether the board hadn't sort of settled on what they actually are looking for in a board position, and they look at the resumes, and then it sort of clarifies for them what they actually want and what skill set they would actually like to include on their board. Or they get some resumes back that aren't quite what they're looking for, and then they realize maybe how they defined the search could be a little finer and more to the point definition, and so they come back. But we had many boards successfully place candidates from our database. And then the other thing, to Jeannie's earlier point, is sort of once you're out there, you're kind of out there. And so sometimes maybe who we send your resume to, that board won't work out, but then somebody on that board has your resume now, and or maybe they have interviewed you, and so for whatever reason it didn't work out on that board, but they probably know directors on other boards as well. So sometimes we've had directors get placed from our database on boards we did not send them to, because it's just another example of the director community helping others who want to get on fund boards. So just to keep that in mind.
Carolyn, you talked a little bit about board specs, and I think boards don't necessarily think about having kind of quote unquote job description. What are they looking for? I think the more granular a board can get in terms of what they're looking for, the more likely they'll find a good fit if they have those conversations. So I encourage the board members on this call to really think about trying to put together a board profile type document. It doesn't have to be very long or complex. It's good because if you do the exercise, then all of you around the table have come to some agreement as to what you're looking for. You can then communicate that more easily within your network to say, this is what I'm looking for. Do you know anybody? Right? And then it continues to go to the network. The candidates can kind of formulate, oh, let me highlight what has been in my experience that actually meets those specs. And I think you can also use the specs to sort of level set your expectations as a board, what you want out of the candidates, not just skills and experience, commitment, capacity, prioritization, as they're thinking about their board journey. So I think getting more granular on the specs in terms of what I would call a board profile. It doesn't happen a lot, but even when somebody else will ask me, oh, do you have any candidates? I'll say, well, what are you looking for? Because I have a lot of candidates, but let's be effective here. So I think a board spec type document is useful.
And if you don't have that, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Jeannie.
I was going to say, and if you don't have that, and this is, I think, to the board candidate question too, about the mandate. If you don't know what they're looking for, yet you're being interviewed, there's nothing wrong with you during the course of the interview to say, what are you looking for in, a trustee? And so let whoever is interviewing you tell you, and then think on your feet and say, hopefully they wouldn't have gotten as far as they did with you if they didn't need it, but that way you could at least know, and that gives you a chance to say, highlight from your background what it is that they're looking for, to have them vocalize that.
Or, Jeannie, I might even say you could frame the question of, what was it about my background that really sparked an interest? What can I tell you more that connects with what you're looking for?
And while we're talking about the interviews, the other thing we wanted to discuss is structured interviews and the benefits of those. We've talked about being strategic, lining up the skills matrix, figuring out exactly what you are looking for or think you're looking for. And then we get to the interview. So I don't know if one of you would like to talk through that process.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think back in sort of the old days, you just chatted with people informally and decided if you liked them, right? People always kind of coach you, oh, it's all about culture. Are you a good fit? Actually, at the MFDF conference in March, there was a conversation focused on sort of the behavioral psychology of the interview process, and how do you structure your interviews to really get at what you're looking for. Because if you just say, tell me about yourself, that's very amorphous, right? And a candidate, especially like me, could talk for an hour and you still don't know if it's a good fit. But the more intentional you are about the questions, I think there's a couple of things you can accomplish. One is you reduce the bias of having known one of the candidates, right? So if you have a structured interview with certain questions and certain individuals ask those questions, you get more of an apples to apples set of responses, and somebody doesn't get bonus points for knowing two or more of the directors. But you can also be very intentional about what you're looking for. So if you're going into like a fund merger and you're looking for somebody who can deal with kind of complex issues, maybe adversarial issues, who has capacity, you'll want to structure your questions to kind of get at those key experiences and how they've handled something similar. So I'll pause there, let someone else jump in.
So I've been this particular role that I'm now on, which is the U.S. Bank platform for closed-end funds. They did use a structured interview process. The first cut was the U.S. Bank as the platform provider. They took in resumes from people they knew, as well as trusted service providers as well. And so they talked to a number of people and narrowed it down to a group of us. And then the law firm, Better Price, did structured interviews asking, and we were told too that we're going to ask the same set of questions to every candidate. So Better asked us, the law firm, the same questions to all of the candidates, and then they made a decision. So I thought that was a use of the structured interview where it was really left to the law firm. I was also in another round of interviews where no one told me it was structured interviews, but I could kind of tell where people would look around and go, oh, it's so-and-so asked the question, and then it was so-and-so. So you could kind of tell that they had questions they wanted to ask, but it was more conversational, but you could tell, and it made sense because the person asking it was more in their wheelhouse to ask. And so there were good follow-up questions that they could ask. So I think structured interviews are a good idea, especially if you're trying to get at something in particular for your board.
Yeah, and I think that's where the board spec comes in again. That is really important because then you know what you're looking for from these candidates, so you can evaluate the candidates against one another as you're considering, sort of a slate of candidates who actually fits the requirements that we're actually looking for. Because I think it is very easy to confuse camaraderie with how someone is actually going to function on a board. So with expertise or with how they're going to function on your board. And so I think, as I mentioned earlier, you're just drawn to people like you. And so the structured interviewing process kind of gets you outside of that a little bit in a way that helps you evaluate candidates fairly between one and among each of the candidates. So you're asking the same questions. So at the end of the day, everybody heard the same answers, and then you can have a discussion about what those answers mean to you as a board member. And I think that's incredibly important. And the other thing I want to mention about cultural fit, because everybody is looking for that. That's what you're trying to suss out in some of these interviews. I mentioned earlier that in the survey, people mentioned sort of lunches and dinners, and that does give people an opportunity to see sort of more the real you than asking some particular questions. And I think the board members who are doing the interviewing in those contexts need to pay very close attention to how those meals go, because I think people just generally let your guard down a little bit over a meal in a way that you're not going to in a formal interview setting. And so you can get more of an idea of who that person is. And just one last thing about culture. I think boards need to be mindful that, yes, cultural fit is very important, but your culture should also evolve over time based on the individuals on your board. And so expecting every candidate to come in and sort of fit squarely in a particular cultural block, I think is not great for board evolution and board effectiveness over time, because each individual should bring something new to your board and help your board evolve in a positive way. And so I think looking at culture through that lens, I think can be very helpful and help boards choose candidates that really do help them get where they want to be, not only today, but in 5 years and 10 years, because these are very long-term decisions, and it's hard to make long-term decisions based on, maybe 2 interviews and a lunch, right? And so you have to be very intentional about how you're doing that, because the downside risk here is very big, because if you make a bad decision, it is very hard to undo that decision, unlike in a workplace setting. And so to be very mindful of that, and that's why you should be very deliberate in your process as you're going out to do these interviews and choosing the candidates that you're looking at.
And Carolyn, those are interesting points, because I think the cultural piece isn't really discussed much at the board level like the skills matrix is, right? It's easy to say, oh, we should have somebody with distribution background, or we should have somebody with portfolio management background. I mean, that's sort of tangible, but we don't have a lot of conversations around the table of, well, we need somebody who isn't afraid to speak up, or we need somebody who is good at consensus building, or, whatever the case may be. That tends to be kind of an unspoken set of skills, and I think we each value different skills. So it may be worth having that conversation when you are talking about the skills matrix to say, let's just take some time to say what is working well about our culture, and where could we benefit from additional pieces that maybe we don't have today. But that's so self-reflective. I think it's a more challenging part of the task, but you're right. I mean, you spend hours and hours and hours around a board table with somebody, and meals and travel and so forth. And so you really do need both. But to your point, it's not just getting along, it's being an effective board. And like I said, building that trust and respect so that people feel comfortable bringing up a position that may not be that popular, but probably needs to be said anyway.
And the rest of the board being willing to hear that opinion,
Mhm.
because I think, it's because I think boards really do value consensus, sometimes at the expense of having a difficult conversation that would be better to have. And so I think finding that balance is really tricky for fund boards. I think this is much more common in the corporate space. I think boards think more about sort of what is their philosophy as a board, how they think about their board service. And I just don't think that the fund boards do it quite as deliberately. But I think as the fund board culture evolves, as we mentioned at the top, fund boards are a lot more deliberate now in who they're recruiting. It's not just the friends from the golf club anymore. And because of that, I think it will require sort of more of these types of efforts, because you're not having natural affinity with people because you grew up with them, you go to the same clubs as them, you see them socially. And so I think as fund boards continue to evolve and develop, because in part our industry is so complex, I think boards will spend more time on this because it will be critically important for their effectiveness going forward. Because when you're overseeing the types of products that you all oversee now, that requires a very high functioning board to make sure that you are all reaching for the same end goal. And maybe you won't get there the same way, but I think to make sure to keep the eye on what the goal is and what the ultimate decision is.
And I think that's why, going back to structured interviews, I think if you think through what is the softer skill sets that we want on the board or need to the board, or even maybe missing on the board, how do you ask a structured question in an interview that would get to that point? And I think one of the ways to think about it is, tell us about, have you had this type of experience, and how did you handle it? And what would the people around the table say about how you handled it? And, to try to get it out that way. Because if you ask somebody, are you collegial? Oh, yes, of course. Nobody's going to walk around and say, I'm the jerk around the table. So I think, and it's not going to come out in probably an interview or two. So I think that's another way to think through a structured interview is tell me how.
Mm-hmm. So, ladies, we just have about 3 minutes. I wanted to see if each one of you in a minute could give us kind of your number one, skill that you think you're going to be looking for in future directors, given the regulatory landscape, what's going on with products, technology advancements. If you can narrow it down to just one, or maybe the first one that pops into your head.
I mean, what pops into my head is somebody who can be nimble in their thinking, right? Because, I mean, we've seen just in the past year or so, the regulatory landscape is changing at a lightning speed, right? And so what we knew back when we were working, when Jeannie and I were working, has changed. So yes, we both have foundations, 30 plus years in financial services. That's a good foundation, but are we continuing to evolve with our learning? Are we continuing to think about things differently and not always, well, this is how we've always done it, right? So for me, yes, there's a table stakes of knowledge, but it's also what do you do with that knowledge? And for me, it's sort of continuing to evolve and think about things differently.
Excellent. Jeannie, do you have one?
I think it's a flip side of being nimble, but I think it's really being curious, because given the changing nature and environment that the fund complexes are going through right now, I think you have to want to before you can even be nimble, you've got to want to understand and learn about the changes and to be able to keep pace, keeping up with it as well, because otherwise you're going to, drown. So I think a naturally curious person with a quest for learning, I think is good as well, as opposed to, I need somebody who knows all about interval funds or all about, private credit or real estate or one of these little pieces, because, who knows, in an alternative space, who knows what your complex will be looking for.
Carolyn.
I would add commitment. I think what you're seeing is boards need to make sure that the candidates that they're interviewing and they're considering adding to their board are committed to the work that it's going to take to fulfill their obligations to fund shareholders, and to remember that they're sitting there protecting the shareholders of their fund who are using these vehicles to save for their, important life milestones, retirement, sending their kids to college, buying a house. And so never forgetting why you're there, I think, is the most critically important skill that any individual can bring to a fund board.
That's an excellent segue. And once again, as a reminder, our last of this 3-part session, we will be talking about onboarding and commitment, and making sure new directors know what they're stepping into. So we are right at 4:00. That's going to conclude our chat for today, and discussion on recruiting new board members. I want to thank the 3 of you for joining us, and for everyone else who attended and listened in online. A wealth of really, really valuable information, and I can't thank you enough. So we will put out an FAQ with some highlights from this session. The recording will also be available and pushed out next week, so that you can refer back to it. And of course, they are always posted on Thompson Hine's YouTube channel. Next month, we're also hosting one on ETF share classes. So tune in for that. And I thank everyone once again.